Let's gently unravel a law from ancient Rome that required old men to wear purple. No, not just to feel regal or help Roman pigeons distinguish sage elders from rowdy teenagers, but because the Romans believed decorum ripened like wine, and that visual cues help stabilize a society full of toga-draped ambitions and olive oil scandals. Imagine, it's a slow, bright Roman morning. The air is soft, minerals inhaled along the Appian Way. Somewhere near the Palatine Hill, a certain Gaius Septimus, aged 62, shuffles toward the public baths. His tunic, a subdued mustard yellow number, flaps lazily in the breeze. Sirens do not exist yet, but if they had, a Roman morality officer might have sounded one. Because Gaius, despite his distinguished years and rather incredible collection of farming metaphors, is committing a sartorial crime. He is not wearing his latest clavus, the wide purple stripe on his tunic marking him as a senator. You see, in ancient Rome, colour wasn't just about style. It was a signal of who you were, how many goats your cousin owned, and whether you could vote on matters involving aqueducts and grain prices. Purple, particularly the deep Tyrian purple, extracted from thousands of mollusks. Yes, snails, ancient Rome was weird, was reserved for the upper crust and the older men who, presumably, had earned the right to look like overripe figs. By law, men in the Senate, or of similar rank, were expected to wear their purple with an air of dignified melancholy, like someone who's both seen the fall of a consul and really misses the good olives from Hispania Baetica. Why legislate garments? Because Rome was obsessed with order, not just military formation order, cosmic order, social order, laundry order. The ancients believed that if everyone played their part, like a grand marble mosaic of citizenry, things worked harmoniously. So the old men wore purple not just to boss younger men around, but to physically radiate their authority. After all, how else would a teenage plebeian know which elder to respectfully nod at while stealing grapes? This devotion to visible hierarchy bled into other garments too. For example, the toga candida, a dazzlingly white toga sprinkled with chalk, was legally mandated for men campaigning for political office. It screamed purity and ambition. Literally, it was blinding. Imagine squinting at a man promising to lower taxes while standing next to a sunbeam. This was both a political strategy and perhaps an early form of voter suppression via retina fatigue. These clothing laws extended to women as well, albeit in ways that now seem tragically oppressive. Virtuous Roman women, read, of high status and properly supervised by fathers or husbands, wore the stola, a long, sleeveless tunic draped modestly and preferably not made of anything that said adventure. Meanwhile, the tunicata, simpler, looser, more daring, was not just a fashion choice but a signifier, sometimes even legally enforced, of one's social or, shall we say, romantic occupational status. The logic, as dreamy and problematic as Roman logic could be, was that everyone should know who was who at a glance. None of this modern nonsense where you can't tell if someone is a senator or a barista. In ancient Rome, you read people like scrolls, and their hemline was the preface. Over time, though, things began unraveling. Literally. By the 3rd century CE, too many people wanted to wear purple. Emperors had to start passing sumptuary laws limiting who could dress lavishly. At one point, only the emperor was allowed to wear an entirely purple toga, the toga picta, and it was so resplendent, so dangerously powerful, that wearing it without permission could get you exiled, imprisoned, or gently stabbed by someone with a name like Cassius. And so, the Romans policed not just crime, but style, because to them personal appearance was public order, stability wrapped in wool. They suspected that if a cobbler wore something too ornate, the foundations of the Republic might gently crack like an underbaked lentil biscuit. As odd as it all sounds now, there was a deep, sleepy wisdom to it. In a city of marble, law, and political betrayal, sometimes your safest bet was just knowing who was wearing which toga and what it meant. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes and let's slowly wander further into the wool-draped world of ancient laws and the dreams they tried to tidy. Picture it. Cobbled streets bathed in twilight, as sandal-footed citizens stroll past marble columns and blinking oil lamps. Welcome to the eternal city, where the wine flowed as freely as the opinions, and there was a law for nearly everything, including, surprisingly, the clothes on your back, and the ones you weren't allowed to wear. Let's recline, perhaps upon an imaginary Roman chaise, and whisper about toga laws. That's right. In ancient Rome, you couldn't just throw on any old toga and flaunt it through the forum like a fashion-forward Julius Caesar. No. There were rules, my dear sleeper. Rules that dictated when, where, and who could wear which kind of toga. Because nothing says civilization quite like wrapping yourself in 20 pounds of wool just to legally exist in society. Now, the toga itself was sort of the Roman version of business casual, though far less casual and infinitely harder to put on. Picture draping a giant woolly bedsheet around your body without mirrors or safety pins. And if you wore one with a hint of purple trim, a toga praetexta, you were either a magistrate or a lucky Roman teenager. Yes, purple was reserved for power and spoiled youth. That stripe of royal purple stitched into the fabric didn't just mean you had clout. It meant you had permission. Wearing purple when you weren't supposed to was not just frowned upon. It was unlawful, criminal even, kind of like ancient impersonation. Picture a guy trying to sneak into the Roman Senate like it's an exclusive club, sporting a sparkly new toga praetexta. He might as well have stitched "arrest me" right into the hem. You see, Rome worried a great deal about appearances. One might say it was their ancient version of social media, status updates, but in wool. And the law liked to keep everyone dressed appropriately for their position. Slaves, for example, had a legal prohibition against any fancy wear. In fact, it was illegal for them to wear belts or nice shoes, because of course, no one wants their enslaved workers getting ideas above their station and, say, walking too confidently. Meanwhile, freeborn Roman women had their own wardrobe rules. Enter the stola, a long, draped dress only for respectable married ladies. The fashion equivalent of a wedding ring, except less shiny and far more restrictive. To wear a stola was to announce, "I'm married, proper, and not remotely interested in your olive oil business proposal, sir." But if a woman disgraced herself, say through adultery or other societal self-sins, Roman law could strip her of the right to wear the stola. She'd be demoted, quite literally, to a different kind of dress, making her visually distinct. Essentially, it was a legal makeover, minus the glam team and with a heavy touch of cultural judgment. Laws about clothing might seem silly now. Imagine getting fined for wearing a hoodie in a fancy part of town. But to the Romans, they were essential tools to keep their very layered social order in place. They believed the state functioned best when every citizen knew their place, politically, socially, and yes, sartorially. Your clothes weren't just clothes. They were a resume that doubled as legal evidence. Even mourning had fashion legislation. When you were in grief, you couldn't just dress in damp pajamas and call it a day. There was a prescribed outfit for that too. Enter the toga puller, a dark, rough-textured wool cloak issued to those mourning a loss. And if you weren't mourning but decided the gloomy chic matched your sandals, well then, tough luck. Unauthorized gloom was discouraged. All these toga bylaws weren't, as one might assume, the result of rampant fashion policing. They were about more than appearances. They helped regulate Roman honor, hierarchy, and who was allowed to appear virtuous in public spaces. The Republic and later the Empire both feared a world where the wrong people looked powerful. Because to Rome, the greatest chaos wasn't a war or a plague. No, it was someone showing up to court wearing the wrong toga. So as you drift toward dreams tonight, picture this: a city where robes act like passports, rulers are tailored into sleeves, and no one dares wear purple without a permit. Stranger yet, it somehow worked. And now, having unraveled our woolly laws of Roman fashion, it's time to soften the flame of our oil lamps and slip gently into the next curious custom. One that involves, of all things, dinner regulations, and why Romans had to legally limit their appetizers. In the balmy lull of a Roman afternoon, somewhere between the last olive at lunch and the first neighbor complaint about goat-related noise, there existed a rather peculiar law. It wasn't about gladiators or empire building or even public bathing, though Rome certainly had plenty of rules about all of those. No, this law governed something much humbler and somehow even more Roman: togas. Yes, togas. Imagine a society where what you wore not only affected how people perceived you, but could also result in being denied entry to the forum, fined, or publicly shamed for sartorial negligence. Ancient Rome had such laws because what you draped across your body wasn't just fashion. It was social responsibility, civic duty, and semi-folded linen propaganda. The Lex Julia passed under Augustus, Rome's very own workaholic emperor with a flair for order and a fondness for legislating morality, stated quite firmly that Roman citizens were to wear the toga on formal public occasions. This wasn't mere dress code etiquette. No, it was law. And Augustus took it personally. The toga, while outwardly just a snugly white wool sheet with vague Grecian cosplay energy, was a billboard. It told the world you were a Roman citizen, a man with civic spirit and the patience of 1,000 donkeys, because wearing a toga required approximately 5 folds, 3 gestures of deep concentration, and the strength of a minor demigod to prevent it from unraveling mid-Senate speech. But Romans didn't always love their togas. They were hot, heavy, and totally impractical for everyday errands, like chasing runaway chickens or insulting rival poets. Over time, toga compliance waned. People preferred tunics, simpler, breezier, and far less likely to trip you in the middle of a courtroom monologue. Augustus, naturally horrified at the creeping spread of comfort and disrespect, decided things had gone far enough. He launched a campaign to restore the toga's sacred status. It included reminders in speeches, public condemnations of badly dressed equestrians, and most amusingly, his own personal practice of wandering the streets draped immaculately like some gloriously patriotic burrito. He even instructed lictors, those baton-wielding Roman hall monitors, to turn away improperly to gate citizens from the forum. No toga, no debate. Imagine being told your civic voice was null because you favored breathable linen. Civic suppression. By wardrobe decree. What made this even more amusing was that togas weren't sewn. They were giant semicircles of cloth, anywhere from 12 to 20 feet long, with no buttons, ties, or magical Roman zippers. To don one properly was a feat, a mixture of origami, interpretive dance, and intense internal questioning about life choices. There are scrolls describing servant-assisted toga application, involving coordinated lifts and twirls, like some backstage prelude to a toga-centric ballet. And heaven help you if you were in a hurry. One wrong fold, and you could reveal far too much toga leg to a scandalized senator. Or worse, trip over yourself while trying to appear dignified near the temple of Jupiter. But Augustus's efforts worked, begrudgingly. Togas made a modest comeback, glossed in patriotic sheen. Citizens complied, some due to fervent belief in Roman ideals, others simply to avoid the awkwardness of being publicly called out for looking like a provincial day trader on his day off. In a city obsessed with formality, sometimes shame trumped even overheating. The irony, of course, was that even as Augustus clung to the toga as a badge of traditional values, Rome was rapidly modernizing. The city's population exploded, immigrants poured in, Greek culture was everywhere, and the average Roman was more concerned with bread, sewage systems, and surviving the chariot traffic than whether their toga pleats were properly rippling in the breeze. Still, Augustus saw the toga as the ideal outfit for the ideal Roman, a walking ode to discipline, majesty, and cleverly secured wool. And for centuries to come, Romans would continue to wrestle themselves into the most uncomfortable blanket known to civilization, all so they could feel a little more dignified while arguing about taxes or philosophers who couldn't mind their own metaphors. So the next time you struggle with your bedsheet or get tangled in your bathrobe, remember, you're just a toga away from participating in democracy, or at least being politely asked to leave a temple. Now, as Roman citizens adjusted their pleats and prepared for another day of very formal walking, another law shimmered on the horizon. One not about clothing, but candles, and how many you were legally allowed before someone accused you of showing off. Ah, the Roman toga, a flowing arrangement of woolen fabric, equal parts fashion statement and bureaucratic dress code. Today, we might associate someone in a toga with frat parties or an over-ambitious Shakespeare audition. But in ancient Rome, it was serious business, and not just serious, legislated. You see, in a society where public image was currency, wardrobe was regulated like imperial coinage. Rome had a law, elegant and punishing, dictating not just who could wear what, but also why, when, and in which degree of flamboyance. Enter the sumptuary laws. Derived from the Latin word sumptus, meaning expense, these laws emerged from the nervous brows of senators who feared one thing above war, plague, or the occasional assassination: that Romans might have too good of a time. These laws aimed ostensibly at preserving Roman virtue, because apparently nothing corrupted the all-conquering empire faster than glittery shoes or a slightly too purple sash. Let's begin with the color purple. In Rome, purple dye was made from the crushed glands of the Murex sea snail. Thousands of these tiny, rebellious gastropods died for a single toga, making the dye rarer and pricier than a moonlit dinner with Cicero. And so, naturally, a law was passed. Only emperors and a very select number of high-status individuals were allowed to wear togas dyed entirely in Tyrian purple. Anyone else gallivanting around in emperor purple risked public scorn, fines, and the sort of social exile usually reserved for those who misuse cutlery at a senatorial feast. One famous incident involved a wealthy Roman equestrian named Gaius Marius. No, not the Gaius Marius, the military reformer, but perhaps a fashion-forward cousin twice removed. He dared to show up at the theatre clad in a fully purple toga, only to be so thoroughly booed by the audience that he fled before Act 1. A tasteful gold clasp might win you admiration. A purple toga? That was social suicide. But the restrictions didn't end with colour. The laws extended to jewellery, feasting, furniture. Even the number of guests allowed at your dinner party was regulated. Picture this. You invite your dearest friends, 16 let's say, but a nosy neighbour reports you. Now you're hauled before a magistrate because you exceeded the allowed number of dinner couches. True story. The underlying message of these sumptuary laws was clear. Modesty makes the empire mighty. Luxury, frivolity, and too many peacock feathers spelled doom. Now, naturally, the wealthy elite found workarounds. After all, if anyone could afford a loophole, it was them. Some hired porters to carry them around, literally, in sedan chairs adorned with ivory and silver, a practice that technically wasn't clothing and thus squeaked by legal censure. Others simply wore more expensive versions of allowed garments. A rustic wool tunic? Maybe. But what about a rustic wool tunic infused with perfume and hand-woven by temple virgins? That wasn't banned. Yet. Meanwhile, the common folk had simpler concerns. Their clothing, dull, durable, occasionally itchy, was never seen as a threat to the Republic's moral standing. Nobody in the forum was clutching their pearls because a blacksmith wore sandals with extra straps. The spotlight, as ever, shone primarily, sometimes literally, on the wealthy. Historians still puzzle over how much these laws were actually enforced. Some think they were a kind of moral theatre, passed more for virtue signalling than for enforcement. A Roman senator would bang the table, demand a 3-course meal limit at dinner parties, and then enjoy a 7-course banquet in private, probably with seafood ramen fetched fresh from Pompeii. Even emperors played fast and loose. Nero, for instance, wore garments so elaborately adorned that he glowed like a walking chandelier. And Caligula once made his horse a priest, so perhaps fine tailoring wasn't the only thing in peril under his reign. Then again, perhaps these laws were an early attempt at sustainability, a slow fashion revolution, Roman style. After all, tossing out a lawfully dull tunic just to chase seasonal trends wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. And so, Roman citizens learned to walk a careful line, stylish but not ostentatious, clean but not conspicuous, fashionable but firmly under Senate-approved limits. Daily life became an ongoing performance in the theatre of just enough. As the night folds gently around us and the rustle of togas fades into stillness, let's drift quietly onward to the private domus and peculiar domestic laws that governed everything, including who could kiss whom and when. Let us now drift, dear listener, down the cobbled lanes of daily Roman life, not the glamorous lives of emperors or gladiators this time, but somewhere far more perilous, the dinner parties. Ah yes, the Roman convivium. To us, it's just a dinner. To a Roman patrician, it was an orchestrated affair of status, decorum, and perhaps 1 or 2 catastrophic decisions involving peacock tongues. And much like everything in Rome, it didn't escape regulation. You see, there were actual laws, yes, state-endorsed decrees, that governed how extravagant your dinner parties could be. Welcome to the curious world of the lex fania, an early attempt at what we modern folk might call portion control with stern consequences. Passed in 161 BCE, this law was a response to what the Senate saw as an alarming trend: the rise of epic feasting, elaborate meals, and the alarming disappearance of actual food from rural areas because it was too busy being transformed into decorative pies shaped like mythology. According to the lex fania, Romans were now allowed to spend only a limited amount on banquets, about 100 asses on regular days, and a slightly more generous 200 on market days and festivals, which still wouldn't cover a decent block of Parmesan cheese today. Imagine it, a senator shifting nervously at his own table, glaring at the roast flamingo and wondering if there was a tax officer hiding under the tablecloth. There was always a fear that some unsmiling official from the censor's office would barge in with an abacus, a scroll, and crushing disappointment. But perhaps it wasn't entirely silly. In a society where lavishness was a currency of power, limiting dinner excess was also an attempt at reinforcing republican values: frugality, order, and restraint, all served with a modest lentil stew. Still, the Romans being Roman, well, they cheated, of course. No surprise there. Hosts would skirt the law by distributing ingredients to guests beforehand and instructing them to cook it at my place, technically shifting the cost, not the cutlet. Some even claimed, with glorious ingenuity, that since birds were not livestock but wild game, they were functionally free, which is how nightingales and dormice found their tragic place on Roman menus. Yet behind each loophole bloomed another law. Enter the lex Didia and eventually the lex Licinia. They were like Rome's version of food-based whack-a-mole. Every attempt to dodge the law was met with, essentially, "Nice try. Here's Latin for no." Of course, this wasn't just about dinner. It was about the Roman obsession with balancing indulgence and austerity, luxury and virtue, a tug of war between silk robes and wool togas, between imported oysters and homegrown turnips. Even the notion of bringing your own chair to a feast was once regulated, as it implied too much importance, unless you were invited by someone equally self-important. If your furniture said consul, but your guest status whispered respectful extra, then you'd best enjoy your turnip standing. The laws tried vainly to slow the Roman appetite for status through supper. But imagine trying to restrict dinner in a world where food was also theatre. It's like telling Broadway to dull the curtains a bit. And so, the laws continued, the feast continued, and the contradictions danced on. There was one striking moment under Augustus, the emperor determined to fix everything in Rome with anxious rules. He reportedly dined on modest bread and cheese, publicly, to set an example. A kind of imperial toast with moral butter. And yet, his banquets were nothing short of culinary opera. This was, after all, the same Rome where fish could gain celebrity status. One senator famously wept over the death of his beloved Muraena, an eel of such elegant poise that she had her own pond, servants, and presumably her own set of existential questions. So the dinner laws, while perhaps earnest in intention, were floating in a stew of irony. They meant well. They just couldn't out-cater the inventiveness of a society where even cabbage salad came with 10 spices and a shadow of philosophical meaning. Still, these laws remind us of Rome's enduring dream: to touch paradise, but budget accordingly. And now, as we gently leave the candlelit echo of Roman dining rooms behind, plates scraped clean and laws mildly violated, we'll take a quiet breath and wander into another strange but very civil matter: how ancient Rome once tried to control the colours you could wear, all with the help of snails. Nestled among the sun-drenched hills and marble columns of ancient Rome, where senators wore togas with more confidence than most people wear bathrobes today, the everyday citizen had to contend with something far more complex than foreign invasions or overcooked garum. I'm speaking, of course, about fashion law. Yes, fabric legislation. Let your eyelids grow heavy as we gently unspool the story of the sumptuary laws, those finely woven threads of control that dictated who wore what, how much it cost, and whether you were allowed to sparkle in public. Spoiler alert, unless you were an emperor or a divine manifestation of Jupiter, probably not. Rome's sumptuary laws were like an ancient dress code, swaddled in morality and sprinkled with an unmistakable Roman superiority complex. These laws didn't just tell people what not to wear. They were about preserving order in a delicate and distinctly hierarchical society. You see, in Rome, appearance wasn't just vanity. It was status, character, and citizenship rolled into one seamless tunic. Take the Lex Oppia, passed during the Second Punic War, a time when Hannibal was merrily tramping through Italy with his elephants, and Rome, understandably stressed out, decided that austerity was the way forward. The Lex Oppia forbade women from owning more than half an ounce of gold, wearing multicolored garments, or riding in carriages within city limits, except during religious festivals. Now, while the men were off trading gladius blows with Carthaginians, Roman women were expected to embrace modesty and practical sandals. But once the war ended and the elephants were led back across the Alps, the women of Rome were not at all thrilled about continuing their minimalist lifestyle. Imagine being told you can't wear your best tunic to a festival, just because Cato the Elder thinks purple thread weakens the Republic's moral fibre. There's a soft kind of rebellion in history, like silk rippling under a bronze sky. And in 195 BCE, Roman women flowed into the streets in protest, not with swords, but with style. They flooded the forum, demanding the repeal of the Lex Oppia. Oh yes, ancient Rome had its own proto-fashion parade. It was perhaps the only instance where political lobbying featured quite so many gold earrings. Eventually, the law was repealed, not because of fashion's undeniable force, but because the men couldn't bear being out-argued by their wives in public any longer. The victory was less about sartorial freedom and more about Romans slowly realizing that everyone, even virtuous matrons, enjoys a little shimmer on the weekend. But Rome being Rome, a city constantly teetering between opulence and puritanism, immediately introduced new restrictions. Other sumptuary laws popped up like figs in a busy orchard. Laws that limited how elaborate a funeral could be. Laws that kept citizens from serving too many courses at a dinner party. Honestly, somewhere deep in time, there is a scroll that probably says, no more than one roasted peacock per banquet, or face a fine. It wasn't just clothing and cuisine. Jewelry came under legislative wrinkling too. Senators were not allowed to wear rings unless they were made of iron, a heavy symbol indeed, lest anyone forget they were public servants, not style icons. Even shoes weren't safe. Footwear colours were regulated. Red shoes, reserved for magistrates, black ones for funerals. And if someone waltzed into a temple in green crocodile sandals, well, the gods might forgive them, but the Senate certainly wouldn't. Of course, enforcing these regulations across an empire that stretched from foggy Britain to sun-baked Syria was like trying to count every grain of couscous at a wedding feast. Some flaunted the rules openly, Others whispered tips for dyeing fabrics just one shade too expensive. But here's the dreamy twist. As much as it sounds like tyranny by textile, the Romans believed that external modesty nurtured internal virtue, that humility in appearance prevented vanity from eroding the stoic heart of the Republic. In theory, a noble senator shouldn't need purple to look important. His toga's folds and his eyebrows did the talking. And maybe, just maybe, as the amber glow of the oil lamp flickers across mosaic walls, we understand that these laws, however strange, were their way of clinging to order, of making sure that even in a world of victory parades and civic chaos, there were rules for robes. Settle a little deeper into your slumber now, as the sandals of philosophy shuffle softly across marble. Next, we drift into a law so curious, it didn't care what you wore, only who you married, and which Roman god might be quietly judging your beloved from the clouds. You know, if someone had told young Publius Clodius Pulcher that one day he'd be remembered not for his scandalous cross-dressing attempts to attend secret women's rituals, but for a quiet Roman law about street rights, he probably wouldn't have believed it. Then again, Rome had rather curious ways of organizing its priorities. Let's take a softly lit stroll down a cobblestone lane, specifically a Roman street from the 1st century BCE. You'd hear the creaking of carts, the clopping of mule hooves, and somewhere in the distance, the gentle muttering of a merchant arguing over the price of stale olives. Nothing too alarming, unless you forgot to build your front steps properly. You see, Roman city planning was surprisingly advanced. Streets were carefully laid out to allow both drainage and social order. So naturally, the Romans came up with a law, because of course they did, that controlled how far a citizen's steps could extend from their home onto the public street. Think of it as the HOA rulebook for ancient times, but enforced by toga-clad magistrates with very stern sandals. This particular law, part of a broader set focusing on viae publicae, or public roads, meant you couldn't just construct a grand staircase that jutted out into the street like you owned the entire empire. There were limits, both literal and legal, usually measured in Roman feet, which were slightly smaller than our modern foot and significantly smellier. Violating this law could land you in some legal trouble, or more precisely, it could land your stairs being torn down by the city's idols, sort of the Roman combo of a code inspector and a party planner. That's right, they were responsible for both infrastructure enforcement and organizing festivals. In many ways, ancient Rome functioned like a slightly chaotic village fair with paperwork. Now, why did this matter? Why so many rules about steps and streets? Because in a densely packed Roman city, with its teetering insulae, those apartment blocks that could be 5 to 7 stories tall and approximately as stable as a loaf of stale focaccia, the streets were precious real estate. Space was tight. People had to share narrow lanes with grocers, water carriers, priests, runaway chickens, and vendors determined to shout about fish at 6 a.m. If everyone started building out into the street, there'd be chaos. Or more chaos than usual. Of course, this stair-step regulation was only one piece of a broader Roman obsession with urban order. They had laws about who could dump what into the street. Answer, technically no one, but in practice, everyone. They regulated water runoff, where your gutters emptied, how high your buildings could be on certain roads, even which side of the street specific trades could operate on. Rome, for all its glory and unstoppable legions, lived in fear of bottlenecks, human, architectural, or otherwise. But here's the amusing part. The law didn't just protect the street. It protected the Roman citizens' delicate sense of personal space, even in an overcrowded city. You may have been living above a loud fishmonger and next to a perpetually angry soap maker named Gaius, who shouted at the moon. But by Jupiter, your morning walk down the street would remain unobstructed by someone's overambitious marble stoop. There's something cozy, even sweet, about a civilization so invested in sidewalk etiquette that it carved its principles into stone tablets before cement was even invented. And in this way, the very banality of stairs becomes a story, one of civic design, shared space, and the quiet dreaming of a city trying to keep its people from tripping over each other, literally and metaphorically. So, tonight, as we stroll past those ancient facades in our imagination, lanterns flickering, the scent of fresh bread mixing with yesterday's olive oil, we can appreciate the little things, the humble stare that minds its own business, the rule that says, yes, you may rise, but not at the expense of your neighbour's path. And somewhere in the inky Roman dusk, a mule snorts, a cart creaks, and we turn the corner into the next softly lit avenue, where another curious law awaits, in the gentle hush of the Roman twilight, while olive oil lamps flickered against marble walls and the distant murmurs of water trickled from courtyard fountains. An unlikely topic cast its shadow over the mighty empire. The humble toga. Yes, that voluminous, oddly folded bedsheet of a garment held more authority than some senators. For in ancient Rome, what you wore wasn't just fashion, it was law. The Lex Julia Sumptuaria, a mouthful only mildly shorter than the togas it governed, was a series of sumptuary laws introduced under Emperor Augustus. The purpose? To tame the wild and sometimes hilariously gaudy impulses of Roman citizens, particularly the wealthy, who were prone to equating dignity with sparkle. Rome, after all, was an empire of moderation, or at least it liked to say so with a straight face, often while nibbling dormice stuffed with honeyed nuts. According to these laws, only freeborn Roman male citizens could wear togas. Not slaves, not foreigners, not women, although women of, shall we say, ill repute, were sometimes legally required to wear togas instead of the traditional stola, as a kind of wearable scarlet letter. Nothing makes a catwalk strut less enjoyable than it being a municipal punishment. But the real delicacy of Roman dress law was in the social signals it transmitted. For example, a senator's toga had a broad purple stripe, the laticlave, a detail that shouted, "I debate loudly in the forum and occasionally fall asleep during legislation." Meanwhile, the sons of noble families wore the toga praetexta, trimmed delicately in purple, announcing that they were both important and not yet old enough to drink wine, legally at least. Now, while the toga sounds splendid in poetry and sculptural elegance, it was in reality an absurd garment. Each toga could stretch nearly 20 feet in length, requiring a complicated series of wraps, folds, and occasional prayers to successfully drape, a fitting punishment for upper-class vanity. Wearing one demanded the posture of a marble statue and the patience of a monk herding silk worms. There are reports, though one suspects these are more winking satire than straight fact, of people dying of exhaustion merely from getting dressed for court. And yet, Roman law held that you must wear the toga for public functions, especially in the forum during lawsuits and for appearing before the emperor. In short, if you wanted your voice to be heard, it had to be muffled slightly by 12 pounds of wool. This judicial fashion policing wasn't limited to men. Roman women were also subjected to clothing commands, particularly around jewelry. There were laws capping how much sparkle a lady could wear in public, part of Augustus's larger campaign to restore perceived moral purity. Gold, yes, the laws seem to say, but let's not jingle when we walk. Why such obsession with clothes? Well, Romans believed that appearances were an expression of the Republic, and later, the Empire. A well-wrapped toga was a visual metaphor for discipline, Roman virtue, and a tacit admission that life in the city might require walking very slowly, lest your outfit collapse mid-stride. In its own starchy, slightly itchy way, the toga was as much a symbol of rule of law as it was a fashion statement. Because in Rome, law wasn't just about who could vote or own land. Law reached into your wardrobe, poked at your brooch choices, and ensured you didn't drape yourself like a Greek. Which, let's face it, the Romans were always a bit touchy about. Imagine drifting off now to the image of a sleepy senator, half draped in his toga, dozing in the curia, as yet another speech drones on about grain tariffs. Behind him, an aide gently adjusts a slipping fold. The entire legal dignity of the Republic held together with pins and polite coughs. And beyond the great marble steps of the Forum, somewhere amid the bustling alleyways and smoky taverns of Subura, a young tailor sighs deeply. Another client wants a toga that doesn't itch. He smiles to himself. Then, friend, he whispers to the night, you want a revolution, not alterations. Let us step lightly away from the toga folds now, and into another peculiar law. A rule about dinner parties, and the surprising legal maximum for how extravagant one could be when entertaining guests. Ah yes, it wasn't only robes that got regulated. Even your lentils had limits. Imagine, if you will, the streets of ancient Rome. Not the glorious marble-pillared postcards historians often show you, but the everyday labyrinth of alleyways, dusty courtyards, and the gentle clatter of sandals on cobblestones. Here, beneath the hum of market gossip and the lingering aroma of fried dormice, one could stumble upon a most curious law. A rule that dictated who could wear what and when. Yes, welcome to the world of Roman sumptuary laws. Those finely woven threads of legislation that stitched morality directly into one's wardrobe. These laws, born of senatorial hand-wringing and upper-class pearl-clutching, were less about fashion and more about social control, sprinkled generously with anxieties about luxury, class status, and the terrifying thought that someone might be enjoying themselves too much. Let us consider, cozy and tucked beneath your blanket of curiosity, one particular fabric-related law. Romans, for all their innovation, had a complex relationship with silk, imported all the way from distant lands, chiefly China, though to a Roman, anything east of Cappadocia was practically mythological territory. Silk shimmered with a quiet decadence that sent moralists into lengthy foot-stamping tantrums. It was far too seductive for the stoic sensibilities of Roman senators, and they soon legislated against men wearing it altogether. Apparently, the gentle gleam of silk suggested softness, perhaps even effeminacy, which was deeply unbefitting for a Roman citizen who was expected to be, well, slightly miserable, perpetually honorable, and obediently rough around the edges. Women, however, were allowed to wear silk, though not without spirited complaints from men pretending to be terribly concerned about the empire's coin purse, rather than simply upset they couldn't dress tastefully. Although commoners rarely had access to fabric whose journey crossed half the known world, Rome put luxury on a pedestal, only to slap it down with laws that snarled, "Don't get any ideas." Not just silk, jewelry too. Another delightful battlefield for legislation. The Lex Oppia, enacted during the Second Punic War limited the amount of gold a woman could wear, less than half an ounce. That's barely enough for an underwhelming pinky ring. And why, you ask? Because Rome was at war, and some clever senator thought the empire would be safer if women weren't dangling too many shiny things. More gold in the coffers, less on the earlobes, so the logic went. But the war ended, and the law stayed. It took years, protests, and the collective chewing of social gristle before the lex opia was repealed, led by women, I might add, who marched spiritedly to the forum and challenged senators with the rhetorical equivalent of an exasperated side-eye. But perhaps the most endearing law of all was about shoes. Yes, footwear. Roman society could be read by sandals, like a dusty, strappy resume slapping against the pavement. Senators and patricians wore red sandals, called mullius for their mulberry hue, signifying their status. Slaves, no sandals for them. In fact, they were forbidden from wearing anything that could be confused for citizen attire. The last thing a senator wanted was someone thinking the man holding the umbrella over his head was his social equal. Curiously, even the bindings on togas were prescribed by law. The more folds, the more importance. If your toga looked like a fabric-based architectural project, congratulations, you were probably someone unapproachable at parties. The humble citizen kept it simple, albeit still uncomfortable, given that togas were designed by people who clearly never tried to walk briskly while wrapped in an enormous bedsheet. And yet, these laws, quirky and restrictive though they were, served a purpose. In a massive, sprawling patchwork of people, customs and incomes, clothing became a way to keep the social order tidy. You could tell who was who at just a glance. After all, it was important for a Roman to recognize whether they should be saluting someone or avoiding eye contact altogether. So next time you slip into something cozy for bed, be grateful no Senate committee is weighing in on your pajama choice. Truth be told, in Rome, even comfort was suspect. And as we roll the final fold of the toga back into storage, let us meander together into another corner of Roman life. One paved with logic, loopholes, and the occasional flying chicken. By the time you'd settled into a third-course Roman dinner, having munched your way through olives, fish entrails, honey-glazed dormice, and a bit of suspiciously grey boar, you might have forgotten that the real performance of everyday Roman life wasn't on the plates. It was written in the law books. One such law, etched into Roman legal history with all the subtlety of a flaming chariot, was the lex opia. Introduced in 215 BCE during the Second Punic War, right about when things were going terribly with Hannibal and his elephants, it was aimed squarely at the wallets and wardrobes of Roman women. Now, imagine you are Flavia, a well-to-do Roman matron. You've just received a stunning saffron yellow stola from Alexandria, a colour so sumptuous it practically hummed. You're dreaming of sweeping into the marketplace in a cloud of citrus silk, the hem whispering secrets to your sandals. Unfortunately, the lex opia says no. Absolutely not. Thank you for playing. The law forbade women from owning more than half an ounce of gold, wearing multicolored garments, including that glorious saffron number, and even from riding in carriages within the city, unless it was a religious festival. The message was clear: austerity now, saffron later. Now, the logic behind this law was, if not exactly flattering, moderately practical. The Republic was gasping under the weight of war expenses. Gold needed to melt into war chariots, not necklace charms. Rome needed its citizens to appear humble so the state didn't appear weak. And when political optics and a dwindling treasury intersect, out go the gilded earrings. But the limits weren't just about hoarding coins. They reflected something deeper. Roman anxiety about luxury undermining virtue. A good Roman woman, according to the stern-faced senators, ought to be modest, industrious, and visually indistinguishable from a stack of clean laundry. This didn't go down quietly. As the years wore on and Rome recovered, well, somewhat, from its Hannibalian headaches, the women of Rome had had enough. In 195 BCE, they descended upon the Forum, not with swords but with sandals, voices raised in protest. They marched, they persuaded, and most alarmingly for austerity-loving senators, they were persistent. Lucius Valerius defended their cause, hands surely gesturing, with theatrical logic, while Cato the Elder thundered that relaxing the law would doom Roman values. The women won. The lex oppia was repealed. Saffron stolers were back on the menu. But the way Rome vacillated between frugality and extravagance would become something of a national pastime. Decades later, emperors would weave their own threads into the fabric of moral law, like Augustus, who created the Lex Julia laws to encourage marriage and punish naughty behavior. It was always a dance between personal freedom and public image, between the hem of a garment and the strength of a republic. Imagine for a moment slipping into the marble silence of a Roman bathhouse, steam curling through the caldarium, gossip rippling like the water in the frigidarium as women and men discuss the latest debates, not in whispers of scandal, but in fabric allowances and carriage privileges. Power in Rome sometimes came in half ounces and dye choices. These laws remind us that even the most powerful empires can't resist trying to legislate the shape of a toga or the sparkle of a clasp, and that rebellions just as often begin in the fabrics of daily life, sometimes literally. So tonight, as your thoughts soften like candlelight, flickering in a tablinum shadows, imagine the rustling whispers of silk in the breeze, the determined footsteps echoing through the Forum. Citizens walking not for war, but for wardrobe, falling asleep in a city where even fashion was politics, and modesty could spark revolution. And speaking of modesty, Rome's laws didn't stop at fabric and finery. In fact, they stretched right into the bedrooms and the dining rooms, and, rather unfortunately, the toilets. But that, dear dreamer, is a story best left for softer lights and slower breaths, just ahead. At this point in our Roman slumber tour, I'd like you to close your eyes, unless you're driving a chariot, in which case, please keep them open, both the eyes and the road, because tonight we step into the carefully managed, slightly over-regulated, but delightfully peculiar world of Roman clothing laws. Yes, dear dreamer, we are about to float gently into the soft cotton, wool threads of sumptuary laws. These were the Roman rules that told you not just what to wear, but who you were for daring to wear it. Now, before you flare your toga in indignation, know that in the Roman Republic, social class was not just a matter of attitude. It was everything, from your vote to your sandals. And so, Rome being Rome, lawmakers devised a patchwork of regulations that basically turned fashion into a political statement, with shoulder pads. Let's begin with the toga. This was not merely a draped bedsheet for lazy afternoons of political scheming. It was the uniform of the Roman male citizen, particularly those of the upper classes. But, and here's the catch, not just any toga. The toga came in different flavors. The toga praetexta, for example, was the one with a purple stripe, worn by senators and certain magistrates. Small children of noble birth also wore it, which leads one to imagine the Senate swarmed with toddlers, all of them loudly debating grain prices. The full purple toga, meanwhile, the toga picta, was reserved for high-ranking generals celebrating military victories and eventually emperors indulging in theatrical entrances. In fact, it was dyed in Tyrian purple, a pigment so costly and laborious to produce from sea snails, poor things, that it was worth more than its weight in gold. Wearing it without the appropriate title could basically get you an express ticket to exile. Or worse. And women. Here too, Rome had rules for the wardrobe. Married women of virtuous reputation wore the stola, a long, pleated dress signaling their status as respectable matrons. But beware, for if a woman had, let us say, professionally misunderstood the concept of nocturnal discretion, she might be denied the right to wear the stola, figuratively undressing her dignity in the eyes of society. Yes, the Roman version of a scarlet letter was effectively a missing outfit. In fact, there was an entire law called the Lex Oppia, passed during times of military crisis, that prohibited women from owning too much gold, wearing flashy garments dyed in exotic colors, or even riding in carriages within city limits. Imagine that. You're a wealthy Roman lady, ready for a fabulous night at the theater, but the Republic says, no earrings, no color, and walk to the Forum. That's democracy. The idea behind this law? To prevent extravagance and restore moral discipline during a time when Rome was battling Hannibal, elephants and all. Because nothing keeps a city strong like a lack of jewelry. The absurdity didn't end there. The law sparked protests. Yes, actual Roman women took to the streets like toga-wearing suffragettes, pleading with the men of the Senate to restore their right to sparkle. And after some years, they succeeded. The Lex Oppia was repealed. Let that be a historical note. Never underestimate the power of fashion-fueled dissent. The sumptuary laws didn't just touch clothes. They dictated how many guests you could invite to dinner, how much you could spend on feasts, even what kind of goblets you could serve wine in. These laws were like Rome's way of saying, we see you've conquered Egypt, but please keep the caviar to 4 spoonfuls, thank you. But why? Why all of this archaic administrative accessorizing? Because in Rome, appearances weren't just vanity. They were virtue. Public posturing turned into public policy. These fashion regulations were less about controlling hemlines and more about controlling ambition. A way to keep everyone in their social lane. You could dream of becoming a senator, sure. But until then, no chocolate-colored sandals for you. There was perhaps a poetic comfort in it too, in a world forever plagued by military campaigns, political intrigue, and assassinations involving salad utensils. Wardrobe laws provided a strange kind of order. A daily script of clothing that let people know, here is your place, and your place looks fabulous in beige. And as you settle under the blankets like a well-folded toga, I invite you to muse gently on this. What you wore in ancient Rome was not about vanity, but identity. Not flair, but function. Every pleat of fabric whispered a story of station, and every hemline hinted at history. We wear identities too, perhaps not stitched in wool, but in subtler, softer threads. Now sleep comes like a warm draught of balsam, poured into your gently regulated goblet. Drift onward, where another twist in Rome's curious codes awaits. It was once said that the fabric of Roman society was woven not by philosophers or generals, but by lawmakers, those wise, if occasionally befuddled minds, who believed that the only thing standing between order and chaos was a well-timed statute and a wax tablet. And among these laws nestled in the scrolls of ancient routine was a regulation so precise, so specific, that it reads today like the punchline of a long-forgotten Roman joke: the salad law. Yes, lettuce had a legal moment. Allow me to explain before your eyebrows arch any higher. You see, in Rome, there existed a whole basket of sumptuary laws, rules that governed how much one could spend on food, drink, clothing, and social extravagance. They weren't born of prudishness or a lack of imagination, but rather a peculiar Roman fear that too much luxury would soften the stern Roman spirit, like an overripe fig in the sun. One such law wrinkled brows across the empire by limiting how many courses a host could serve at dinner, not out of concern for indigestion, but to prevent social competition from spiraling out of control. If Gaius served a peacock-stuffed dormouse with honeyed oysters over a 7-course bacchanal, then surely Lucius would feel compelled to outdo him with, say, an edible recreation of Mount Vesuvius erupting dessert wine. So the Senate did what it did best. It passed a law. Enter the Lex Fania, a modest proposal from 161 BCE designed to slap restraint back onto the dinner table. This law placed strict monetary limits on how much could be spent on a banquet, depending on the occasion. A regular dinner, 30 asses. A feast celebrating the return of a son from war, slightly more. A wedding banquet? Fine, splurge a little, but don't get ridiculous. This led to a nation of banquet guests peeling open fig leaves hoping for a side of roast boar, only to discover, alas, more figs. The wealthy tried to wriggle around the law, of course. Some served multiple mini-meals throughout the day, each creatively rebranded. This isn't a dinner, it's a digestive interlude. This isn't dessert, it's ceremonial fruit. Cato the Elder, Rome's forever scowling uncle, would have cheered. He believed in simple living, famously grumbling that luxury would be the end of Roman virtue. He once praised cabbage as a cure-all, digestive aid, potion base, facial mask. If Cato had his way, your dinner plate would be indistinguishable from your medicine cabinet, and all of it legal under the Lex Fania. But the salad law didn't stop at the edge of the dinner table. It seeped quietly into fashion. There were limits on how much one could spend on purple dye, because purple, that notoriously moody hue extracted from sea snails, had grown into a symbol of wealth and nobility. Too much purple, and you might be accused of impersonating the emperor. Too many courses, and you might be trying to replace him. Other laws tried to regulate women's adornments. The Lex Oppia, for example, restricted the amount of gold a woman could possess, the colors she wore, and her use of fancy carriages. This law did not last. The women of Rome, with magnificent flair, took to the Attu streets in protest, draping themselves in togas and stepping boldly into the forum. One senatorial onlooker described the scene as a siege conducted with perfume and logic. In time, sumptuary laws became more of a polite suggestion than an enforceable threat. They were still recited, still engraved into the law tables, but were often observed only in the breach, much like modern resolutions involving kale. And so, Rome slowly learned that you can tell people what to eat, but you can't make them enjoy it. You can write a law about lettuce servings, but someone will always find room for a second helping beneath the kale leaves. Somewhat ironically, the laws meant to preserve Roman virtue paved the way for Roman creativity. Chefs mastered the art of illusion dishes, giant roasts shaped to look like humble stews. Hosts invented complex seating rituals to rotate dishes in and out, just far enough apart to qualify as separate gatherings. There was, it seems, no shortage of cunning beneath a Roman tunic, and somewhere in the background, waxed tablets sighed beneath the weight of yet another amendment, another clause, another exception. Rome wasn't always efficient, but it was frequently inventive. Now, let us gently fold these scrolls, cooled by time and lavender-scented candlelight, as we turn toward our next tale. A whisper of gossip, marble corridors, and the peculiar laws governing where and how one could use the Roman bathroom. In the dustier scrolls of Roman law, nestled somewhere between statutes about toga protocol and how many guests one might invite to dinner without offending Jupiter, lives a peculiar decree concerning funerals. Yes, funerals. You see, in ancient Rome, even death had to follow the rules, and the Romans, ever meticulous about regulations and equally obsessed with appearing sensible, had an entire set of laws governing your final exit. Along with your living will, you might as well have drawn up a permit for wailing, because that too was regulated. The law we drift into tonight is the Lex Julia de Moderatione. Sounds lofty, doesn't it? But in good Roman fashion, it really means something like the Julia law of not overdoing it at grandma's funeral. Rome, as dignified as marble steps can look under the Mediterranean sun, was always at risk of emotional display, and nothing, absolutely nothing, threatened that noble image like uncontrollable grief in public. Let's start with the basics. Professional mourners, also known as praefectae. These were mostly middle-aged women with tremendous lung capacity and no off switch for despair. You could hire a cohort of them to attend your loved one's funeral, and their sole job was to cry louder than reason would allow. They wailed, battered their own chest dramatically, tore at their hair, and sometimes even threw themselves on the ground theatrically, which, for a price, they did quite convincingly. But Rome, practical even in mourning, decided this was a bit much. The Lex Julia eventually curbed these over-the-top displays. Emotional outpourings were fine, but only in measured quantities. There was, quite literally, a legal limit on how sad you could appear, which sounds cruel at first, but bear with me. The Roman elite had turned mourning into affordable performance art, and some funerals resembled more of an opera than a farewell. The bigger the spectacle, the more powerful the family appeared. In fact, in certain circles, you were judged not just by how you lived or whom you conquered, but by how many paid strangers screamed into the heavens when you died. Clearly, a correction was in order. So Augustus, our obsessive reorganizer of Roman society, decided to bring in a little orderliness. He wanted Rome to be moral, moderate, and much less interested in competitive grief. Thus restrictions were introduced. Fewer ladies howling at funerals. No more elaborate parades of scruffy actors, pretending to be ancestors, and toned-down spectacles overall. Besides, the public streets weren't exactly designed for parades of mourners keening like wind through a haunted vineyard. The funeral processions caused traffic, noise complaints, and the occasional panicked call to a local augur. Romans were deeply superstitious after all. You never knew when all that wailing might wake up something less welcome. There were also laws limiting how much you could spend on funerals, which, while sensible, led to some truly creative cost-cutting. Imagine a family poring over a papyrus spreadsheet to determine whether Uncle Flavius deserved 2 flute players or just 1, or whether a commemorative urn could be carved from discounted limestone rather than imported marble. Now, here's where it gets even better, or perhaps curiously sleep-inducing. The job of the censor, yes, that's the title, was to oversee the moral conduct of citizens, which means that technically, if your funeral caused too much of a ruckus, A stern-faced man in a crisp toga could posthumously scold your family for conduct unbecoming of Roman values. A sort of ancient Yelp review, but with fewer stars and more civic shame. And so, funerals settled into something calmer. A dignified march, a well-placed tear, a speech if someone had time to practice it. Rome, with a sigh of relief, returned to quiet order. The mourners didn't all lose their jobs, of course. Some pivoted to dramatic storytelling or ghost interpretation. But the days of loud, lavish laments gave way to something a bit more muted and legally manageable. And just below the marble surface of Roman prudence, one could still find a quiet shimmer of drama. After all, the Romans didn't ban grief. They just asked it to keep the volume down. Now, as the last echoes of a restrained Roman sob drift into the night, let us touch upon something altogether livelier. What, you may wonder, were the ancient rules about dinner parties? Ah yes, the invite list was its own kind of battlefield. But we shall unravel that curious scroll. Softly and soon. Long before zoning boards and homeowners associations wrote angry letters about improperly trimmed hedges, ancient Rome had its own set of, let's call them, enthusiastic regulations. Not just fires and bricks sort of laws, but full-on lifestyle micromanagement that would make your local city council blush. And nestled within this scroll-bound tangle of expectations, there was a particular set of laws dedicated to something so fundamentally human. You'd never expect the Roman state to weigh in. Luxury. Ah yes, luxury. That silky, velvety thing that creeps into bathhouses and breakfast platters alike. And the Romans, gods bless their structured souls, oscillated between craving it and condemning it. Enter the sumptuary laws. You see, dear listener, Roman senators were often richer than a well-fed dormouse in a grain silo. But there was a catch. Even if your net worth could finance a minor war in Gaul, Roman law dictated just how much of it you could actually enjoy in public. These weren't just gentle nudges, mind you. They were laws with teeth. The Lex Oppia, for example, passed during the Second Punic War, restricted women from possessing more than half an ounce of gold, wearing multicolored dresses, or riding in carriages within the city, unless it was a religious festival. Imagine telling a Roman matron she couldn't exit her villa in her finest silks because Hannibal might be at the gates. The law was supposed to preserve wartime austerity, but really, it gave Roman men the illusion of virtuous restraint, while quietly sidestepping into banquets of stuffed dormice and honeyed wine behind closed villa doors. Sumptuary laws extended to dinners as well. The Lex Fania, introduced in 161 BCE, regulated how much an upper-class Roman could spend on a dinner party. Picture this: a Roman host measuring chickpeas and calculating the papyrus sheet budget to ensure he didn't surpass the legally allowed 100 asses. That's Roman currency. Not, as one might cheekily suppose, an army of donkeys delivering pies. The law even dictated how many people could be invited and what kinds of meats could be served. Peacock tongue, frowned upon. Flamingo ribs, potential legal dilemma. Honey-glazed ostrich eggs. Only if the prefect wasn't looking. All of it stemmed from a genuine Roman worry that luxury would erode moral fiber, that Rome's strength lay not in imported spices or golden goblets, but in good, solid rustic cabbage. Now, were these laws strictly enforced? Not exactly. Like most things Roman, they were followed about as rigorously as instructions on an IKEA scroll. The laws existed more to set moral tone than to actually lock kitchen cupboards. and therein lies the sleepy charm. Rome loved appearances, even if that appearance was publicly honoring restraint while privately hoarding Persian silk under your bayou drawer. One senator, Publius Clodius Pulcher, famously flouted these norms by parading about town in women's clothing, crashing religious ceremonies, and generally ignoring modesty with joyful indifference. His dietary choices likely included more than his share of sumptuously censored delicacies. But while the law may frown, the dessert tray smiles on. The truth is, Roman sumptuary laws were the moral speed bumps of antiquity. Gentle reminders from a slightly uptight republic that you could be dazzling, just not too dazzling. You could sparkle, but damn it, not in a way that embarrassed the Senate. And yet, behind these limitations was a flicker of wisdom. Rome worried, perhaps wisely, that too many soft couch cushions made a nation forget how to ride a horse, row a trireme, or lift the front right corner of a war elephant, preferably with friends. They feared that wealth without virtue was like a tunic without a belt, dangerously loose. Still, there's something oddly tender about a civilization that tried to litigate dinner parties and golden brooches. It reflects an age where rules weren't just about order, but about shaping identity. The Romans loved extremes, yet feared their pull. And so they gently scolded themselves with rules about pork portions and peacock feathers. Tomorrow's dawn will bring us further into their world, a world of taverns, teeth, and surprisingly hygienic obsessions. For now, let your imagination soften like a moonlit toga and drift off among the silken embers of ancient restraint in the filtered light of a Roman morning where clay rooftops glowed like crusty loaves of bread and laundry flapped like togas in flight. A curious hush settled over the city. Beneath the all-seeing marble eyes of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, senators bustled in their sandals, matrons clucked at vendors, and children chased each other through colonnades. All of them, lest they forget, were being quietly governed not only by an empire, but by a thick scroll of laws, some so oddly specific you'd wonder what toga-wearing tragedy had inspired them. Take, for instance, the famous Roman law of sumptuariae, or, as we might kindly call them, the stop being so fancy laws. These mere mortals attempting to limit human bling started with noble intentions. In a world where senators were elbowing each other to buy leopard skin cushions and hand-carved oyster forks, Rome decided enough was enough. One of the more famous restrictions came under the Lex Oppia, passed in 215 BCE during the Second Punic War. The law capped women's ownership of gold to just half an ounce, banned the wearing of multicolored garments, and, brace yourself, prohibited women from riding in carriages within the city, unless they were heading to a religious festival. Otherwise, ladies, you were officially hoofing it. Now, was this a bold move in wartime austerity, or a terribly timed toga tantrum against accessorizing? Opinions varied. The law was initially a way to conserve resources, while Hannibal was busy bringing elephants over mountains and existential crises over dinner tables. But once the war ended and Rome resumed its usual flair for the extravagant, the ladies of the city had had enough. In 195 BCE, an unforgettable scene unfolded. Roman matrons, draped, determined, and entirely on foot, flooded the forum in protest. They weren't violent. They didn't hurl amphorae or brandish wooden spoons. No, they simply stood in the streets and made it passionately, perhaps fashionably, clear that they would not be told what to wear or where to ride. The men of the Senate, after ducking behind pillars and nervously adjusting their laurels, eventually repealed the law. It wasn't the only law attempting to moderate Roman indulgences. There were restrictions on how much one could spend on a dinner party. Imagine inviting guests over for a feast and calculating whether your stuffed dormice and imported peacock tongues exceeded the legal max of, say, 100 asses, the Roman currency, which, yes, does delightfully open the door to many donkey-related punchlines. The tables of Roman banquets were subject to more scrutiny than Caesar's daily assassination odds. Lucius Fabius, a praetor, once inspected banquets to catch overindulgences. Picture a man with the combined personality of a tax auditor and a disappointed grandmother, peering over your roast veal and tallying its market value. But lest you laugh too freely, remember, these laws were Rome's attempt at morality preservation and class control. In a society where wealth sloshed around like garum sauce and the classes jostled for higher spots on the marble wine rack of life, sumptuary laws aimed to stabilize the wobbly pyramid. And then came rules about how loud or large a funeral could be. Too many musicians, too many cries of grief, too much rose petal, flinging, and you might be accused of overdoing it. Because nothing brings dignity to death like a strictly enforced silence and a floral budget. Romans also feared excessive mourning could upset the gods or smear one's reputation. Grieving, you see, should be proportionate, not to the love lost, but to one's social standing and legal dignity. Hiring mourners, that is, professional wailers paid to weep theatrically, was heavily policed. Too many tears, and it looked suspiciously sincere. Or worse, too nouveau riche. And laws even leaned into the realm of grooming. Men were advised not to wear too much perfume. Women could be punished for using beauty potions that had, shall we say, alchemical side effects. In a culture obsessed with order and balance, even aesthetics had limitations written into scrolls and enforced by magistrates, some of whom were, quite arguably, in dire need of their own fashion audits. But Roman laws weren't always about restriction. Sometimes they were about ritual, rhythm, and providing the great machine of life its melodic tick. Regulations made the chaos legible, the decadence manageable, and the toga less likely to be worn upside down after one too many sips of Falernian wine. Now, let's leave the parties and the protests behind. The roosters are dozing, the forums are quieting, and somewhere in the shadows of the Palatine Hill, another peculiar Roman law waits patiently to reshape our dreams. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman life had picked up a certain momentum, like an ox cart with squeaky wheels, slow, slightly chaotic, and surprisingly regulated. Rome, ever suspicious of too much fun, had developed a curiously fussy habit of legislating behaviors that, frankly, most people wouldn't expect to be government business. And yet, nestled among these many scrolls and edicts was one of the Roman Republic's more deliciously detailed fascinations: the regulation of dinner parties. Yes, in ancient Rome, dinner could be a carefully measured public affair, thanks to a little something called lex sumptuaria, sumptuary laws. These were the kinds of laws that mainly said, "That's too fancy, tone it down." It all started when Rome, flush with riches from its expanding empire, noticed that its citizens were beginning to enjoy their newfound prosperity just a touch too openly. Silk, imported wine, 7-course seafood banquets served on gold plates by flutists. Unacceptable. The Roman Senate, in a fit of stern grandfatherly concern, decided someone ought to set a limit before the Republic turned into an all-night toga brunch, So they did what any self-respecting legislative body would do. They passed laws restricting how many guests you could have for dinner. Not as chefs do now, for ambiance, but as lawmakers. Citizens were told quite firmly that they could have no more than a certain number of dinner guests unless it was a holiday, a funeral, or they had a very, very good excuse. Good food, the Senate believed, could make people weak, greedy, or worse. Etruscan. The Lex Fania, passed in 161 BCE, and later the Lex Didia, crafted in 143 BCE, placed oddly specific limitations not just on dinner guest numbers, but also on courses, costs, and even the types of ingredients one could use. Exotic spices, banned, peacocks, taboo, excessive truffles, best not even mention them by name. You might ask, was anyone actually enforcing these laws? Did some poor Roman official spend his evenings sneaking down alleyways, sniffing for unlawful roast duck? Well, sort of. There existed appointed officials called aediles, who were in charge of marketplace regulations, public cleanliness, and, you guessed it, sniffing out culinary excess. They could, in theory, show up mid-banquet and tally up your courses. If you were caught exceeding the legal limit on extravagance, you'd be fined, heavily. That imported fig pie from Asia Minor could end up costing more than a new tunic and a minor bribery charge combined. The reasoning behind all this culinary moderation was deeply rooted in Roman values, mors maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. In other words, the belief that all greatness came from humble, cabbage-based beginnings. The founding fathers of Rome were said to have dined simply, worked hard, and conquered nations using hearty porridge and relentless civic guilt. So the lawmakers, ever fond of nostalgia, decided that returning to simpler meals would keep virtue alive and the empire from turning into a toga-clad gossip magazine. Yet, here's where it gets truly Roman. While Rome's senators piously restricted the peasants' goose livers and sea urchin foams, they often found loopholes that allowed them to eat lavishly nonetheless. For instance, if you framed your dinner as a religious observance or a sacred familial rite, suddenly that roasted flamingo served on a bed of dyed lentils was entirely appropriate. Isn't belief awe-inspiring? We even have letters and plays poking fun at these restrictions, because of course, as soon as anything is outlawed, it becomes instantly more fashionable. Lavish secret dinners continued. Hidden courses were tucked in between legal ones, and loyal slaves were expected not to whisper about the spiced dormice to nosy neighbors. There's something timelessly human about it. The idea that somewhere in the night, a respectable Roman patrician on the Senate's ethics committee was secretly washing down illegal oysters with restricted wine, using a curtain as cover and a harpist to drown out the sound of his own guilty chewing. Over time, these sumptuary laws fell out of fashion, like wooden sandals and national humility. The empire expanded, markets grew, and enforcement waned. Eventually, it became clear that the average Roman had two unstoppable appetites, one for conquest, the other for dessert. And so, the laws faded like yesterday's bacchanalia, leaving behind only crusty marble, inscriptions, and a few slightly judgmental kitchen utensils. But the spirit of those dinner tables, of society trying very hard to regulate indulgence with admirable, if confused, vigor, remains a charming morsel in Rome's banqueting history. Now, the table has been cleared, the wine jug stoppered, and the aediles quietly tiptoeing homeward. But while the Romans kept an eye on your supper club, there was another area they took just as seriously: your socks, or rather, your shoe style. But that's a tale best laced up gently as we drift into sandal law next, back in the warmly flickering twilight of ancient Rome, when the empire was flush with marble statues and slightly suspicious wine, there existed a law that took aim at something rather scandalously mundane: dinner parties. Yes, let us delicately peel back the olive-scented curtain of the Lex Orcia, a sumptuary law passed in 181 BCE. What does sumptuary mean? Think of it as ancient Rome's way of saying, darling, tone it down. These were laws that limited extravagance, not for moral reasons necessarily, but rather to keep up appearances of modesty while everyone's toga hems quivered with barely suppressed ambition. The Lex Orcia, specifically, dictated how many guests one could reasonably invite over for supper. And heaven help you if you thought hosting more than 3 friends was an innocent act. According to the Senate, inviting too many people to share a roast dormouse and a goblet of Falernian wine could lead the entire republic into the fiery depths of gluttony and moral decay. Naturally, why such an ominous view of a social gathering? Picture this: Rome was swelling with wealth from its recent conquests, but with sudden riches came the terrifying rise of the nouveau riche, those pesky, upwardly mobile plebeians, throwing lavish feasts and wearing gold-studded sandals like they owned the place. And law-abiding senatorial types didn't like it one bit, so the Lex Orcia attempted to preserve traditional Roman austerity by putting a snug little limit on the dinner guest list. 3 guests max, 4 if you counted your cynical cousin, who always just happened to be in the neighborhood. Imagine the stress of choosing. Do you invite Gaius, who brought that excellent anchovy relish last time? Or Marcia, who's terribly witty but owes everyone money? Terribly Roman dilemmas. The idea was to prevent Rome from turning into one eternal banquet, where ambition, gossip, and truffle-stuffed flamingo tongues ran unchecked. Smaller dinners, the thinkers believed, led to simpler tastes, less political scheming over the cheese plate, and a better night's sleep. Of course, Romans being Romans, compliance with such laws was deliciously optional. Much like pretending to read Cicero at parties. You see, sumptuary laws, while as stiff as a centurion's helmet plumes on scroll, were famously unenforced. Enforcement would have required somebody to hover outside suburban villas with a guest list and a nose for truffles. Not quite dignified work for the average magistrate, but that didn't mean no one took them seriously. Cicero himself later mused on the moral value of such laws with the wistful tone of a man who both believed in virtue and enjoyed the occasional fourth canapé. For some, these laws were symbolic boundaries, a gentle nudge toward moderation, or at least a warning not to be seen pairing peacock tongues with 10 senators and a lyre player on a Tuesday. And so, Roman hosts got creative. They'd host a tasting for 3 at their home, and then just happen to allow a dozen others to wander in through the atrium. Some furtively held gatherings in gardens, where technically no walls meant no household limits. Others swore their extra guests were just passing through at mealtime, a coincidence as statistically likely as a toga staying wrinkle-free at the public baths. Still, there was something enduringly Roman in trying to legislate the number of chairs at a table. Order enforced by decorum, with the paranoid sheen of a Senate trying to stop its own upper crust from curdling. Of course, all this begs a dreamy question as you settle in under your cozy blanket. What sort of laws await us when gluttony wears a different robe? When the excess is digital rather than digestive? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. And besides, A gentle yawn indicates it's time to let the dinner party fade, the lamp oil dim, and the soft breeze of antiquity rustle the curtains once more. And next, we drift gently outward, toward another curious Roman law, one that raised eyebrows and altered waistlines. This time, not in the dining room, but in the wardrobe. By all modern standards, Rome was a city of splendor, bustle, and occasional mild terror involving lions. But amid the grand amphitheaters and marble-draped senators, the real heartbeat of Roman life pulsed through the quieter corners of society, where laws, often with the subtle logic of a half-remembered dream, quietly sculpted daily life. Which brings us to a law so specific, so charmingly candid, that it almost feels like a line from an ancient sitcom. In Rome, millers were not allowed to steal flour from customers by blowing it away. Yes, blowing it away. You see, in the long-forgotten days before pre-packaged pasta and electric bread makers, every neighborhood had its grain mill powered by actual muscle, water, or on particularly sophisticated afternoons, donkey. People would bring their grain to the miller, who would grind it into flour for a modest fee, ideally without resorting to gymnastic-level cheating. But humans being delightfully human in every era, some millers found that if they stood just right next to the grindstone, and performed what appeared to be an innocent exhale or a casual gust from a passing sneeze, enough flour could be wafted away to make quite a profitable side pile. Of course, fairness was a Roman obsession, especially when it came to weights and measures. So lawmakers, perhaps seated slightly downwind from a bag of suspiciously light flour, banned flour blowing. Millers who got caught were slapped with a fine and presumably a recommendation for less theatrical methods of theft. This peculiar little law reveals something deeper about Roman ideals. They believed the act of doing business, even humble, flour-covered business, was sacred. It was a matter of dignity and reciprocal respect. So you see, even if there wasn't a law against stealing flour by eating it during the grind, deliberately blowing it away, that was just rude. Another law, equally practical and equally curious, revealed Rome's delightfully literal approach to regulating food. Goose sellers, yes, sellers of large honking birds, were forbidden from plucking feathers from live geese in the market. Now, in fairness to the goose pluckers, the plumage trade was booming. A good set of down feathers meant softness, warmth, and the chance to doze off into luxurious dreams, while still technically living inside a one-room insula beside a tanner's shop. Demand was high, but so was the commotion caused by a half-plucked goose running amok through the forum, honking unprintable squawks and drawing the ire of senators, pickpockets, and startled philosophers alike. So the law did what laws do best. It put a polite but firm stop to the honking chaos, declaring that all feather removal must take place in a private setting, ideally where startled geese wouldn't take out a fruit stall in protest. Both examples showcase an undeniable truth. Romans didn't just legislate high matters of state and conquest. They legislated food, and feathers, and sneaky air currents. Then there was the quietly brilliant law controlling how bakers paid their debts. In the bustling economic dance of Rome's markets, bakers, essential as they were, sometimes found their coin purses a little, shall we say, light. Rather than sulking off to the nearest creditor with excuses about grain costs or sudden oven malfunctions, they had an answer more poetic than practical. Pay in loaves. Yes, rather than denarii, a baker in debt could, with appropriate record-keeping and solemn nods, pay their creditors in actual, tangible bread. it was carbohydrate-based commerce at its most literal. One could only imagine a Roman banker's vault, stacked not with gold, but with attractively crusted, accounting-approved baguettes. It's easy to chuckle at such a law, but functionally, it made perfect sense. Bread was the Roman staple, a culinary constant as essential as air or gossip. To require payment in bread was, in a way, to anchor commerce in reality, something useful, nourishing, edible. Watching the empire through the keyhole of its oddest laws gives us a charming little truth. Rome didn't just command the legions, it managed loaves and feathers with equal fervour. And somewhere between the criminal sneeze of a miller and the lawful loaf of a bankrupt baker, the city kept itself sewn together. Let's slip a little further into the folds of Roman legality and discover what happened when wine was a little too fragrant. In the lull of ancient Roman dusk, when the forum's cobblestones radiated a final warmth from the day's sun, and the sound of sandals on stone softened into a lullaby, Roman citizens retired into the quiet solace of their domus, homes filled with echoes of distant speeches, clanking wine cups, and the ever-watchful eye of the law. Roman laws, you see, didn't go to sleep. They lingered behind closed shutters and curtained atriums, subtly regulating things as seemingly simple as leftovers and the brightness of your toga. Let us drift gently, dear listener, into an especially curious corner of Roman legal life. The law that strictly regulated dining, and not because of cholesterol. This was the Lex Fania, a law so wonderfully nosy it peeked at your guest list and poked around your kitchen before the first oyster hit the grill. Originally passed in 161 BCE, this sumptuary law made it official Roman business to limit how extravagant your dinner parties could be. In modern terms, it would be like the government telling you that you could only have 3 guests at your birthday brunch, no guacamole, and definitely no gold-plated cake. The Lex Fania was named for Gaius Fannius, a man who, judging by his legislative enthusiasm, must have had a neighbour who threw particularly loud and meaty soirees. The law's intent was both moral and nervously economic. Rome, after all, had acquired quite a bit of wealth from its expanding empire, and along with it came a surge in indulgent behaviour. Rome's upper crust began piling their tables with delicacies like dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, flamingo tongues, and fish so exotic they probably had their own citizenship. The Roman Senate, ever suspicious of excess that didn't involve military parades, decided to step in. The law imposed spending limits on banquets, no more than 100 asses for an ordinary dinner, and up to 300 for festal occasions, which sounds generous until you realize that wouldn't even buy half a luxury eel. But regulating Roman appetites was like trying to hold olive oil in a sieve. Soon enough, clever hosts found delicious loopholes. Some would hold their dinners in wooden sheds built outside city limits because the law didn't technically apply beyond the pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome. Others would serve enormous meals, but insist guests bring their own food, a sort of bring-your-own-banquet policy that verged on culinary surrealism. Roman enforcement, too, was theatrical. Inspectors known as aediles were tasked with monitoring public morals, which often meant they unofficially moonlighted as dinner crashers. They'd show up unannounced to count how many lobsters you were hoarding, or whether you dared to serve peas out of season. It was moral policing with a side of gossip. Imagine the tension in a Roman kitchen, the whispering among slaves. Hide the peacock, the Edels are at the door. A perfectly grilled ostrich might be shoved behind a curtain. A vat of fine wine rerouted to a bath. Hosts became amateur magicians, banishing excess into wardrobes and under furniture, all while making polite conversation and refreshing everyone's goblets with technically permissible goat milk. But beyond the comedic bustle, the law tells us something deeper about Rome's social fabric. Wealth, the Senate feared, could corrode the traditional virtues: frugality, modesty, and discipline. The Republic adored its legendary ancestors, plain tunic-wearing farmers who ate simple porridge and tamed empires with grim resolve. Lavish banquets, with their truffle-stuffed birds and gold-dusted snails, stood in mockery of that story. And yet, the tension between austerity and abundance, restraint and indulgence, was baked into the Roman experience. The more they conquered, the more extravagant their dinners became, and the louder the calls from senators to return to the old ways. It was like building a palace and then feeling guilty enough to sleep in the stables. By imperial times, the sumptuary laws were quietly sidestepped or ignored altogether. Emperors like Nero reportedly hosted feasts where rose petals fell from the ceilings in such volume that guests were smothered under their divine scent. That, dear dreamer, is a truly Roman way to meet your end. Suffocated in a room so fragrant and illegal, it might have terrified even Gaius Fannius himself. As we set down our goblets and clear away the imagined crumbs of celery and garum, we step out from behind the curtain of edible discretion and into another curious chamber of Roman life. A place where laws didn't attend feasts, but instead tucked themselves silently into your closet, patiently awaiting your wardrobe choices. The Romans, in their infinite and highly organized wisdom, had a rather impressive collection of laws aimed not just at governing behavior, but at orchestrating it like a polite, toga-clad symphony. And among these curious laws was one that sounds delightfully petty until you dig deeper: a legal prohibition, yes, an actual law, against extravagant mourning. That's right. In the empire that built aqueducts, invented concrete, and could run a chariot race for half a day without blinking, there was also a law that said, essentially, "You've wept enough, Claudia. Take a breath. The state approves." Roman lawmakers, perhaps exhausted by operatic wailing on the streets of Rome that put even the most dramatic gladiatorial death scenes to shame, decided to put some boundaries on grief. And so came Lex Alia Sentia and Lex Furia Caninia, collections of restrictions that, among other things, told citizens how many flute players they could hire for a funeral, how many mourners could be present, and, my personal favorite, how much crying was officially allowed. None of these, however, was quite as famous or surreal as one particular rule. Women were legally barred from scratching their faces during mourning. Yes, no face clawing, which tells us two things. First, that Roman women didn't play around when it came to expressing sorrow. And second, that lawmakers had likely witnessed things at funerals they could never unsee. Grieving Roman women, especially among the elite, would throw themselves into a fury of lamentation at the death of a loved one, or in some cases, at the death of a loved one's bank account. They would dishevel their hair, beat their chests, wail operatically to the gods, and yes, sometimes rake their fingernails down their cheeks in visible grief. It wasn't a simple pass the tissues moment. It was a full-scale theatrical production. So, in the name of public order, senators decided that enough was enough. Enter the public decency clause: no blood, no scratches, and no melodramatic convulsions outside a certain decibel level. But these laws weren't simply prim and proper attempts to suppress emotion. They were meant to suppress extravagance of both money and, well, performance. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of Tone it down. You're making the neighbors uncomfortable. In the late Republic and early Empire, mourning had become, like everything else among the elite, a competitive sport. Who could appear the most devastated? Who could afford the most professional mourners? Those literal paid criers who followed the funeral procession like a traveling grief band. And who, oh who, could lay out the best catered spread after the burial? It stopped being about Aunt Cornelia and started being about who had the most ivory urns and weeping peacocks. So the Roman state stepped in, as the Roman state often did, and said, actually, no. One horn player, maximum, 2 hired mourners, and absolutely no self-harm for dramatic flair. Also, please stop throwing ashes in the governor's koi pond. The law's intent was to restore dignity to what was becoming pageantry. And in the classic Roman fashion, they tried to legislate decorum as if it were a building code. Even Julius Caesar once took issue with the overstated funerals of his time, not because he disliked mourning, but because funerals had become political theatre. A well-orchestrated funeral could stir public emotion in dangerous ways, especially if the dearly departed was a beloved senator, perhaps one slightly too beloved. And so emotional displays became regulated like traffic flow. You could feel sad, but not too sad. And if you did feel genuinely gutted by the death of your father-in-law, you would need to express that within the state-sanctioned frame of dignified weeping. Yet one can't help but imagine the internal, but struggle of Roman women in black tunics, hands twitching at their sides as they resisted the primal urge to go full operatic grief mode. Picture them standing near the funeral pyre thinking, "Ah, Quintus, you were horrible at dice, but I shall miss you." Though alas, these cheeks must remain unscratched. It's these peculiar details that give ancient Rome the flavour of a place not unlike our own, overwhelmed by appearances, obsessed with protocol, and quietly acknowledging that sometimes people just go a little too far with drama. And so, as the flames of another Roman funeral flicker in your imagination, you can rest easy knowing that even in grief, the ancient Romans found a way to keep things tidy. Now, drift quietly as we wander toward the next curious custom, one that involves geese, gods, and just a touch of divine bureaucracy. While many Roman laws were crafted with an air of gravitas, scrolls, senates, and the occasional orator dramatically flinging his toga over his shoulder before making a strong point, some laid bare the daily oddities of managing millions of people in sandals and tunics. Among them was a law so quietly curious, it rarely appears in marble inscriptions or sword and sandal epics. The sumptuary law known as the Lex Oppia, passed in 215 BCE, which limited how much gold women could wear, how fancy their clothes could be, and, brace yourself, banned them from riding in carriages within the city, unless it was a religious festival. Yes, ancient Rome, with its sophisticated plumbing and dramatic appetite for conquest, also had a serious opinion on jewelry and chariot decor. The Lex Oppia was introduced during the grim hours of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal was camped with his elephants uncomfortably close, and Rome needed every spare denarius for military rations rather than glittery accessories. The law aimed to promote austerity, frugality, and a sort of shared hardship, a polite way of saying, please stop wearing imported silk while the empire is bleeding at the elbows. Its enforcement, however, was curious. Roman matrons could technically be fined or humiliated for excessive accessorizing. Ever so gently, of course. This was not exactly the kind of crime that ended in lions at the Colosseum. Still, the law stung, and as wartime stretched into peacetime, that sting began to itch. By 195 BCE, 2 decades later, the women of Rome had quite literally had enough. What followed was one of the more politely dramatic moments in Roman political life. A group of Roman women organized a peaceful protest in the Forum, urging, well, possibly insisting with considerable polite volume, that the law be repealed. They stood just outside the Curia, where the senators gathered, and embodied the very thing the law had warned against: public display of women with opinions. Cato the Elder, notable for his bushy eyebrows and being generally grumpy about change, was appalled. He thundered on about how, if women could sway laws now, tomorrow they'd be storming the Forum with golden hairpins and requesting voting rights. Imagine. But the Senate felt that maybe, just maybe, these women had a point. The law had outlived its usefulness, and besides, gold looked ever so well in the Mediterranean sun, and so the Lex Oppia was repealed. The carriages rolled once more, and wide-sleeved tunics fluttered down the Via Sacra, scandalizing precisely the people who most enjoyed being scandalized. But Rome did not abandon sumptuary legislation entirely. Oh no, far too practical for that. Instead, they tinkered. New laws came and went, restricting luxurious feasts, purple-dyed fabric, which, thanks to the use of thousands of tiny sea snails, cost more than a decent villa outside Capua, and even how many guests could be invited to dinner. This last one was known as the Lex Fania, passed in 161 BCE. It limited Roman banquets to a maximum spend and guest count, which made hosting a dinner party into something like preparing for a surprise tax audit. The motivation behind these laws wasn't just moral scolding. It was about keeping the social order tidy. Rome had a complex hierarchy: senators, equites, plebeians, freedmen, the whole gang. If everyone suddenly started wearing 6-inch sapphire brooches and serving flamingo tongue on Tuesdays, it would become dreadfully hard to tell who outranked whom. And as any Roman would assure you, who ranks whom was the central pillar of polite conversation and inheritance law. Yet wildly enough, many citizens found ways around the rules. Banquets shifted to underground dining rooms. Women wore more subdued outer garments, but sparkled underneath like walking treasure chests. And purple, well, perhaps just a little hemline here, a tinge in the toga there. Nothing criminally robust, you understand. So Roman law hustled to keep up with Roman creativity, and vice versa. In a slow dance we might recognize to this day, make a rule, find a loophole, patch the rule, spot a new workaround. Civilization, in its sleepy, bureaucratically glamorous rhythm. And with our elbows resting gently on a silk-trimmed cushion and our golden earrings metaphorically tasteful, we drift onward through Roman law and leisure. Next, we tiptoe into an entirely different realm, where public toilets, citizen dignity, and sponge sticks intersect in a way that only Rome could rationalize. Imagine you're a Roman citizen, but not one of those toga-draped senators solemnly swinging their philosophical opinions around the Forum like sacred laundry. No, you're a modest, olive oil-smudged soul who mostly wants two things: to avoid stepping in anything unpleasant on the way to the bathhouse, and, crucially, to avoid violating any one of Rome's countless, and often baffling, societal regulations. Tonight, let's wander through one that floated quietly beneath the grander, more dramatic laws and yet touched nearly every Roman home, hearth, and, oddly enough, hairstyle. Yes, let's softly run our fingers through the Lex Oppia. It was, quite literally, a law about looking too fabulous, passed during the Second Punic War in 215 BCE, a time when Hannibal was bulldozing elephants through the Alps and Rome was feeling justifiably nervous. The Lex Oppia was a reaction to austerity, morale, and perhaps envy. Named after the tribune Gaius Oppius, the law did something highly particular. It limited the amount of gold a Roman woman could own, banned wearing overly colourful clothing, especially dyed in the scandalously luxurious Tyrian purple, and forbade women from riding in carriages within the city unless it was a religious festival. Imagine, you're a woman in ancient Rome, and suddenly you're not allowed to wear your favourite saffron shawl, can't jingle your elegant little earrings, and must rely on your sandal-clad feet to carry you to Saturn's temple, while old senators rattle by in their four-wheeled finery. This, understandably, did not go over well. Now, from the Senate's perspective, it was an act of noble sacrifice. Resources were tight. The fate of the Republic hung in the balance. And, well, wealthy women parading in silk tunics and gold bracelets while Rome burned its fields felt less than ideal. But from the perspective of those said women, the Lex Oppia was a deeply personal attack on glitter. It's worth noting that the Romans didn't see personal adornment solely as vanity. Fashion was woven with status, duty, symbolism, and ritual. A purple stripe on a tunic could mean political rank. A modest veil could signal piety. The suppression of ornamentation was seen by many as not just financial control, but a cultural muzzle. Fast forward 2 decades, when the war dust settled, Hannibal had been diplomatically disinvited from further appearances in Italy, and Rome was once again basking in its usual imperial glow. The women of Rome had had enough. A movement began, not one of riots or rebellion, but one of remarkably patient, well-dressed disobedience. Women began advocating for the repeal of the Lex Oppia. They flooded the forum, not with swords, but with speeches. Middle-class matrons, wealthy widows, and everyone in between argued that peace had returned. Rome was thriving, and perhaps they could have their gold hairpins back. Unhappily, not every senator agreed. One particularly famous killjoy, Cato the Elder, a man composed entirely of stern looks and dried garum, warned that allowing women to vote with their earrings would lead to the very downfall of male authority. But even Cato's formidable disapproval couldn't stem the tide. The Lex Oppia was repealed in 195 BCE, to the sound of relieved sighs and the distant tinkle of freshly reclaimed jewelry boxes. Now, was it a silly law? Perhaps, but in its way, it reveals something fascinating. Rome wasn't merely obsessed with power and conquest. It was, just as much, preoccupied with optics. The dance between extravagance and humility, between appearances and ideals. They feared that visible wealth during a time of collective hardship might dissolve unity. Or perhaps Rome simply did what it did best, creating rules to polish its own image, even if it meant dulling the sparkle of half the population. And yet, the aftermath of the Lex Oppia's repeal had a quiet result. Those public debates in the Forum marked one of the few times women's voices burst clearly into the Roman political sphere. Jewel-flicked arguments transformed into a moment of civic agency, proving that even through a gold chain light enough to wear, a heavy argument could be pulled. So next time you're tying your hair, slipping on a bracelet, or glancing at your reflection in a sleepy puddle, remember the women of Rome, who once fought elegantly, calmly, for the simple right to shimmer. And with that, let's drift gently onward. For just around the corner lies a Roman law as peculiar as it is poetic, concerning dinner guests, and how many you were legally allowed to have. While the citizens of ancient Rome marched with purpose through their marble cities, cloaked in togas, sandaled with strategy, and shaded by sylvan porticos, they were also being quietly, efficiently, and sometimes bizarrely guided by the long, invisible hand of the Roman legal code. Tonight, we find ourselves drifting into the curious world of Roman sumptuary laws. Ah yes, the well-dressed laws that told you precisely how not to be too well-dressed. If you've ever wondered what happens when an empire tries to legislate modesty, welcome to dinner with the censors. You see, Romans had a thing about excess. They loathed it with the same enthusiasm with which they pursued it. So, naturally, Rome made laws to keep luxury under control, because nothing says down with extravagance, like micromanaging the thread count of your tunic. Take the Lex Oppia, passed during the Second Punic War, a turbulent time when Rome was fighting Carthage, and evidently gold jewelry too. The law, legendarily stern, prohibited Roman women from owning more than half an ounce of gold, wearing multicolored garments, or traveling in fancy carriages within city limits. Essentially, the Lex Oppia said, "Ladies, you may triumph inwardly, but please do so in sandals and grayscale." This led to an outrage not unlike a toga-twisting dash through the forum. Roman matrons, who had grown quite fond of their shiny accessories, gathered in protest. In a rare show of public pressure, they actually helped get the law repealed 20 years later. Which makes sense, because if you're going to survive the Punic Wars and still can't wear purple silk in a chariot, are you really living? But the Roman state didn't stop there. Oh no. The Lex Fania attempted to regulate the number of guests one could host at dinner parties, because, clearly, a feast of 12 might collapse the Republic. This law decreed that on regular days, no more than 3 people could be wined and dined in your home. But on market days, you could stretch to 5. And on the Saturnalia festival, the legal gluttony threshold gently expanded to 9 guests, still below what one might call a banger. One can imagine the quiet tension as households trimmed their invitation lists, carefully debating whether cousin Gaius would contribute to lively conversation or merely overuse the garum. And speaking of food, meat was put under surveillance too. The Lex Orcia, itself a wallflower of Roman statutes, didn't just limit spending, but tracked how ostentatious the meat portions were. Turkey, pork, goose, they all had to appear in socially acceptable quantities. Imagine a praetor measuring the girth of your ham roast with judicial ambivalence. What's delightful, in a sleepy sort of way, is that the senators who passed these laws, most of whom owned villas with more grape fields than sense, barely followed them themselves. Dinner parties in senators' households still sparkled with roasted dormice and honeyed peacocks. These were, after all, the same men who devised a law against reclining at meals on certain days, apparently forgetting the entire Roman eating posture was lying sideways like artistic, overfed lizards. And then there was the toga. Oh, the mighty misbehaving toga. It became a subject of social regulation as well. One's clothing was a legal signpost. Only freeborn Roman citizens could wear a proper toga. Magistrates donned togas with purple stripes called latus clavus, looking like imperial candy canes. And boys graduating into manhood wore a special toga virilis, a plain white garb signifying their new status, and likely the awkward start of toga-based adulthood. Yet, it wasn't all restrictive. Many Romans viewed these laws as necessary to safeguard mos maiorum, the customs of the yoke ancestors, They believed rules around dress, food, and public extravagance helped shore up virtue in the face of wealth and indulgence. If you squint slightly and sip a little mulled wine, you might even see a point, or perhaps drifting further into your pillow and the shadows of another world, you smile at the idea of the world's most powerful civilization enforcing waistline humility and errant jewelry control. Even buried beneath ruins, Rome whispers these odd little truths: that humanity, no matter how grand the marble or how soaring the Senate, couldn't resist the urge to both revel in luxury and then create entire bureaucratic departments to feel guilty about it. And so, within the stone and scroll heart of the empire, everyday life was a careful dance choreographed by laws trying valiantly to mold restraint from abundance and modesty from opulence. But rest, gentle listener. The laws may get stranger still. As the slow torchlight of ancient Rome flickers its last flame for the evening, let us drift one final time through the cobbled alleyways and marble forums of a world both puzzling and peculiar. Rome, that magnificent tangle of togas and triumphs, was held together not only by legions and aqueducts, but by laws, many of which were, frankly, as rigid as a senator at a dinner party, and sometimes twice as strange. Now picture yourself reclining on a triclinium, wrapped in a light woolen blanket that's probably been laundered less than you'd like to know, sipping watered wine that tastes vaguely medicinal. As pets scurry under the table searching for dropped olives and fig pits, you hear an aged magistrate wax poetic about his favorite law, the lex fania, Rome's attempt to legislate morality one dinner plate at a time. This law, passed in 161 BCE, was the legal embodiment of that one friend who insists on splitting the check by what everyone ordered, down to the last grape. The lex fania didn't want you spending too much on dinner parties. In fact, it told you how much food you could serve. That's right. Ancient Rome tried to curb excess by deciding how many chickens you were allowed to roast on a Tuesday. Spoiler alert, it wasn't many. According to the law, on ordinary days, a citizen was allowed to serve just a modest meal. On market days, the limits were lifted slightly, because naturally, a better cheese might fall into your basket. The law laid out exact spending limits for banquets, which meant Roman hosts had to choose between luxury and legality. You could impress your guests or avoid a hefty fine, but not both. Not unless you were very clever with lentils. Of course, this wasn't the only Roman law rooted in creative restraint. The Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, Julius Caesar's long-winded way of matchmaking by legal decree, forced the upper crust to marry and reproduce. Senatorial classes were encouraged, via tax perks and inheritance laws, to propagate the Roman version of a successful family, full of stern brows, austere statues, and children named Lucius. Celibacy, in a twist worthy of romantic comedies, could lead to property seizures or political stagnation. Essentially, in Rome, if you weren't partnered up and producing heirs, the law would very gently but very firmly elbow you toward the altar. And then there was the peculiar prohibition against burying the dead within the city walls. Yes, the Romans loved many things: victory columns, military parades, and throwing shade with elegant insults. But they most certainly did not love necropolises in the heart of town. Death, as far as law was concerned, was to be kept at a polite distance. Hence, why the Appian Way, that great imperial highway, also became a rather scenic cemetery. Wealthy families competed to build the Caesar's tomb just outside the gates, ensuring they remained visible even in the afterlife, a sort of eternal real estate flex. But perhaps one of the most charming and oddly specific laws came from the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest code, etched onto bronze and grumbled over by schoolboys and sticklers alike. One law declared you couldn't dismember a corpse to trick the inheritance system. You know, just in case you devised a cunning scheme involving clever amputation and creative paperwork. It's shockingly unclear whether this was a frequently attempted tax dodge or a warning in advance. You see, Roman law wasn't just about control, it was about identity. These laws, no matter how baffling, told Romans who they were. Farmers in tunics, governors in togas, matrons in stolas, each living within a society where law curled around daily life like ivy on a column. From the Senate floor to the baker's stall, from family dinners to funerals, the law was ever present and ever peculiar. And now, as dusk falls over this empire of organized oddities, we can ease into slumber with the comforting thought that even a civilization as grand as Rome was constantly trying to make sense of itself, one oddly specific ordinance at a time. The wind through the 7 hills carries whispers of senators debating poultry restrictions, of patrician families squabbling over dowries, and of toga, wearing orators delivering flowery speeches about acceptable methods of spoon distribution. Strange, but somehow cozy. Sleep now, traveller of time. Let the marble colonnades fade into moonlight. Let the scrolls roll up neatly, and let the jurisprudence of ancient Rome settle gently at the back of your dreams. For tonight, history is quiet, and the city finally rests.